Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a massive, big picture look at how our political and economic frameworks evolve over entire decades. If you want to understand the underlying forces shaping your future career in the age of AI, you really need to understand the historical map we're about to unfold. So let's get started.
Take a look at the middle of the 20th century here. Under Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the top marginal tax rate was, get this, a staggering 91%. When folks today see tax rates creeping up toward 40%, the word socialism gets thrown around pretty quickly. But as this 80-year zoom out shows, our baseline assumptions have shifted drastically over time. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates that exact shift in perspective. This quote from Bernie Sanders jokes about that 91% rate under Eisenhower. The implication here is fascinating, right? Policies that might be swiftly labeled as socialist or radical today were actually just standard mainstream economic policy in the post-World War II United States. Our modern political labels aren't timeless at all. They are entirely dependent on the specific era we live in. Now, just to maintain strict historical accuracy here, we need to clarify what those sky-high percentages actually meant in practice. These were statutory marginal rates on the absolute highest earners, not the effective tax burden paid by most Americans. That 91% rate only applied to income above a very high threshold, and the tax code back then was packed with deductions, exclusions, and shelters. Very few taxpayers actually paid that full top rate. But even with those caveats, the foundational philosophy was undeniable, a broad belief in heavily progressive taxation at the very top. So to understand why a 91% tax rate made total sense back then, but seems basically impossible now, we have to talk about political economic orders. These are massive, overarching governing philosophies that last for several decades. They shape our laws, our institutions, and the fundamental assumptions of society. Individual presidents don't just create these eras overnight. Instead, they inherit them and operate within these massive frameworks. They're essentially the background operating system of a society. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds. When we map this out across the last 80 years, we can essentially divide this entire period into two distinct 40-year blocks. First, from the 1930s to the 1970s, we had the FDR Keynesian order. Then, starting in the 1980s and running up to the present day, we've had the Reagan-Hayekian order. And right now in the 2020s, a lot of historians and economists believe we're in a massive transition phase out of that second order and into something entirely new. All right, let's look at Act 1, the FDR Keynesian order, which ran from the 1930s through the 1970s. This era was born out of a profound, literal crisis. During the Great Depression, Americans watched banks fail, red lines grow, and unemployment just completely skyrocket. Consequently, the public lost confidence in pure laissez-faire capitalism. The consensus became that if left entirely to its own devices, the market could lead to ruinous outcomes for the average person. Out of that crisis emerged a totally new set of core assumptions. The consensus demanded an active government managing the economy, with full employment as a central national goal. It was an era defined by the muscle of strong labor unions, progressive taxation, the birth of the safety net, like Social Security, and massive public investment. There was this broadly shared expectation across the political spectrum that the government had a fundamental responsibility to stabilize capitalism and expand middle-class opportunity.
But, eras inevitably end. By the 1970s, the FDR order was seriously buckling under the weight of high inflation, oil shocks, and stagnant growth, a really painful combination we call stagflation. Confidence in the government's ability to manage the economy absolutely plummeted. This opened the door for Act 2, the Reagan-Hayekian order, or the neoliberal era, which took root in the 1980s and has shaped our world right up through the 2020s. This new order brought a completely different philosophy to the table. The defining belief totally flipped. Freer markets, not government intervention, would generally produce the best outcomes. This meant sweeping deregulation, slashed top tax rates, privatization, and a massive push toward globalization. The government was no longer viewed as the solution. In many ways, it was seen as the primary obstacle to economic efficiency. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is when we place these two governing philosophies starkly side by side, the contrast is absolutely staggering. In the FDR era, government manages capitalism and labor is central. In the Reagan era, markets organize society and globalization dominates. This isn't just a minor shift in policy. It's a total inversion of a society's baseline assumptions about how the world should work. Which brings us to a really critical pause.
Are we entering a third order? Just as the New Deal consensus broke down in the 1970s under inflation and oil shocks, the Reagan-era consensus is currently under immense pressure today from a rapidly changing world. The solutions of the 1980s and 90s just don't seem to perfectly map onto the problems of the 2020s.
Because remember, new orders don't emerge just because one political ideology suddenly wins a debate. No, they emerge because unprecedented new conditions force a different governing philosophy onto society. Look at the pressures we're facing today: the explosion of artificial intelligence and automation, aging demographics, undeniable climate pressures, skyrocketing housing and healthcare costs, and a fundamental shift in the nature of work itself. These are structural, seismic shifts.
And this brilliantly illustrates how our entire political vocabulary is mutating to adapt. The 20th century debates were rigidly framed as socialism versus capitalism. But look at the new debates emerging today. We're talking about industrial policy, AI governance, state capacity, resilience, and the economics of abundance. We are basically retiring old arguments because they simply lack the bandwidth for these transformative technologies.
All of this brings us to a specific year on the horizon that could serve as a major historical catalyst: 2028. Now, why 2028? Well, assuming current constitutional term limits hold, the 2028 presidential election will be the first open contest, meaning no incumbents for either of the two major parties, since 2016. This open election creates the perfect environment for new ideas. Both parties will be undergoing heavily contested primaries, essentially forcing them to redefine themselves. By 2028, AI and automation are going to be exponentially more advanced than they are today. Candidates will be forced into a search for a long-term vision rather than just playing day-to-day political defense. It's an environment where competing visions of the next era will be fiercely debated.
Now, you might be thinking of historical giants like FDR or Reagan, who won massive map-wiping electoral landslides to mandate their new orders. But today's geographic and media polarization means a 49-state landslide is highly, highly unlikely. However, transformational leaders today don't necessarily need a massive landslide. They just need to win enough to establish a lasting national consensus, to plant the ideas and institutions that will outlast their specific presidency.
So what will those candidates actually have to answer? Here is a specific, imminent problem for you to consider about your own path. How do we ensure people find meaningful work as automation expands? This isn't a left versus right question. It's a societal survival question. When AI tutors, medical diagnosticians, and automated logistics become the norm, how does the average person find their economic footing?
To answer that, society might need entirely new structures. Let's think about some of the concepts being debated as potential future institutions. Massive AI literacy programs, heavily subsidized lifelong learning, universal basic income, universal basic sabbaticals to allow for retraining, and entirely new democratic reforms to govern digital spaces. Now, I present these strictly as possibilities, not predictions. But ask yourself, how might your own education or your community's local economy have to adapt if some of these become the new normal?
Ultimately, every generation inherits a political economic order, and every generation helps shape the one that follows. We've moved from the New Deal, managing capitalism, to the neoliberal era, unleashing markets, and now we stand at the precipice of something entirely new. So I want to leave you with this lingering, provocative thought. What kind of society should we build for the AI era? The answer to that question will absolutely define the next 40 years of history. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.